Hi, Dr. Musselman. I'm Mario Vion. I'm with the Hoosier Rails to Trails Council.
Very nice to meet you, Mario.
Good to meet you. So you're at the beginning of your involvement with the Nickel Plate Trail, especially as concerns prairies,
began probably in the 1990, I'm going to say.
Okay.
And my wife and I were looking for prairie grass. We had been out in Kansas and fallen in love with the prairie grass out in Kansas, and we were driving around Miami County. I had an old atlas from 1890s, and on this atlas it had an outline of where the old prairie was up around Birmingham and Macy area in northern Miami County. So we were cruising the back roads looking for any remnants of that prairie grass, and as we crossed the railroad right away, and the rails were still in place at that time, we noticed this big blue stem and some Indian grass, some of the taller prairie grasses, and some of the other forbs, which are the broadleaves that grow in the prairies. We noticed some of these along that trail, or along the railroad right away there. So we stopped, and I have photographs of my wife and I walking along the railroad right away there, or walking the rails, you might say, looking at the prairie remnant that was there. We did some research, found that when the Nickel Plate Railroad came through that area in 1895, they had surveyed an extra wide right-of-way at Birmingham, thinking that Birmingham was going to be a boom town, and the farmers would bring their grain there, and they needed a siding. So there's a 300-foot wide survey area there that has been preserved since 1895. Never been plowed. Just happened to have all the prairie remnants right there, pretty much intact. So we contacted our local Rails to Trails people. I was aware at that time that they were going to start doing something as far as the bicycle trail. It still had rails there at that time, but I talked to Bill Click, and there were some other locals that were involved with setting up this Rails to Trails, and said, you know, there's something very unique up here at Birmingham you need to take a look at, and I think it's worth maybe thinking about preserving that, because it's the only remnant of the prairie that's left in Miami County. Everything else has been plowed up, but since the railroad commandeered that right-of-way in 1895, that has never been plowed. So it's the only virgin prairie left in Miami County.
The preservation of the prairie leads back to Indiana's history. So was Miami County extensively prairie previously?
No, there were just some fingers of prairie that came from the west into Miami County. Northern Miami County is rather flat and just conducive, I guess, to this prairie grass. But there is an outline of where the prairie used to extend up there around Macy, and it was really quite extensive. I mean, several square miles, probably tens of square miles.
This is part of Indiana's history, if you will. And so what kind of life was sustained in a prairie kind of grassland?
Kind of life?
The forms were, people were, was it a place where deer would forage, or?
Okay, the one account that I've read said that the Indians would burn that prairie off to keep the trees from growing into that, encroaching on that, and so it was kind of maintained, so maintained prairie perhaps because of for hunting. You know, they could shoot the deer and probably buffalo back then that were in the prairie grass that you might not be able to do so well in a forest. So it was kind of an intentional prairie, I think.
I see. And the grasses, and are there other types of plants that are prairie that are indigenous?
Absolutely, yeah. There's a whole classification called forbs, which are the broad-leafed plants that grow in the prairie. Rosin, weed, compass plant, some sunflowers, various sunflowers that will grow There's a milkweed as well that's unique to the prairies. And there's the butterfly milkweed, that orange milkweed growing. And we found some of that growing there. It was just amazing to see in the about July, this orange milkweed blooming out there, you know. We contacted the Bill Click, who then contacted Mr. Vonnegut in Indianapolis, and they actually wrote a grant then to help preserve this area because the neighbors were encroaching on the prairie from the west. They were mowing, and from the east, a man had actually pastured a horse there for several years. Wasn't his ground, but nobody objected, you know, so he just pastured a horse there and planted some clover in amongst the prairie grass so the horse would have something to eat. Sure. And mowed it down. And when we saw that, there really wasn't any prairie grass growing in the eastern portion where he had pastured his horse.
And the technique for restoring that prairie?
Pretty much leave it alone and let Mother Nature do her thing. The area that had been pastured, I wasn't sure if there was anything left there, but I decided before we would do anything with that, we would just see what came back naturally. And I was just amazed that the big blue stem came back, the Indian grass came back, some of that beautiful orange milkweed came back. We've since gone along the trail and transplanted some pale purple coneflower echinacea into that area. So the eastern portion we're using as kind of a restoration area. I'm trying to bring some things in from other areas of Miami County that we've scoured and found some unique prairie plants growing by themselves in other areas, and bringing that in as kind of a textbook of what a prairie should look like. But on the west side, we haven't done anything but burn it every other year.
And the burning helps preserve?
The burning keeps down the woody plants just like the Indians did.
Okay.
So, but I don't want to burn it every year because there's other insects and things that need to reproduce in this environment as well. So I give them a chance to reproduce there, and then go across the rails to trails to the eastern side, and then we'll burn that every other year. So we're kind of doing half and half as far as the burn is concerned.
In your mind, how important is the preservation of the prairie, and how important is the preservation of railroad corridors important to the preservation of prairies?
Well, the railroads have done a remarkable job of preserving prairies, or preserving whatever type of habitat happened to be there, because when they go through, they pretty much, the farmers don't plow that area, you know. There's areas west of Miami County that have a lot of prairie along the railroad right-of-way,
okay,
up along 35 being one of them. I used to work up at Knox, Indiana, and so we drive up 35, and I've noticed a lot of prairie habitat up that way. But as far as Miami's concerned, Miami County's concerned, this is the only remaining.
And what's the significance of preserving a prairie in your mind?
Well, it's a unique habitat that has unique species of plants, unique species of bird life. I'm kind of a bird watcher, so I enjoy seeing some of the unique birds and so forth there too. And in Miami County's case, it's just the only place that there is any prairie. So that was my initial thrust, was just to preserve that. I'm on the Historical Society in Miami County, and I thought that was a pretty important part of our history to preserve. But prairies preserve a unique habitat, you know, and deserve to be preserved just for all of the diversity of flora and fauna that exist only in that habitat. All the way up this corridor in Miami County is such a diverse habitat anyway, I can only speak for Miami County, really. You know, I'm born and raised here, but Southern County is a whole different habitat than the Northern County, and it goes through two river watershed areas there that have unique habitats to both of them, and preserving that is essential to just preserve a diversity of biology.
The uniqueness of this prairie, from your studies in Kansas and other places, has what place in your mind as opposed to other prairies, or is there a difference between a prairie in one place and a prairie in another place?
Well, the genotype of the grass is no doubt different. I have an area on my farm of about 10 acres that we have acquired seed, have gotten seed from Birmingham and then planted over on my farm because I wasn't sure that it was going to get preserved at that point in time. So I'm kind of backtracking a little bit. But we, in the fall, about this time of year, we stripped a lot of seed off of the big blue stem and little blue stem and Indian grass primarily to plant in a second place in Miami County, because that was the only place in Miami County where that genotype was growing, and I wanted to preserve that genotype, so we took some seed and then planted it over at my farm, and that's kind of an elaborate process to get a prairie started.
Okay, but the nickel plate then has been helpful in helping you preserve the prairie.
Absolutely. You know, from a historical, Miami County historical standpoint, that was the only source for Miami County genotype seed for all of these plants that we're talking about. Our little preserve then that we created over at our farm serves as a second source of Miami County genotype seed should anything happen to the prairie at Birmingham. I think now it won't, because we've got it preserved. We have a fence around it, and it's secure.
And another question comes to mind: is there a prairie as opposed to a dry prairie?
Yes, a mesic prairie is the term for a wet prairie.
Okay.
And part of this prairie actually is, and then you have a little different grass type growing there. Prairie cordgrass. I had to think about that for a minute. Prairie cordgrass is a mesic prairie grass. And there's also a pink blossom. I have to think here for a minute the name of it. But there's some unique things that grow in a wet prairie versus a dry prairie.
Do you have a vision for an expansion of this prairie, or do you think that the effort should be made in just preserving how do you say, establishing a way of making sure that this prairie is preserved for the future?
Well, there's a fence around that little portion of prairie, and unless they would buy the surrounding area, and I don't imagine that'll happen, they could seed it longitudinally along the trail a little bit more. You know, we could take some prairie grass seed and kind of sow that on down the trail a little bit, because there are other prairie grass forbs growing in that 2-mile section, but the actual blue stem grass is only pretty much in about half of that.
Okay.
So that could be expanded within the confines of the trail right now.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Doctor.